Hi. Every now and then, someone says, why are people paying so much attention to what's happening in Gaza? After all, there are really, really terrible things that happen all over the world and don't get very much attention. And there are certain standard answers to this. One answer for Americans is that the United States is very deeply complicit in the slaughter in Gaza in the way that it's not in many other places where people are suffering a great deal. Another more general answer is that people tend to pay more attention to what's happening in Israel-Palestine because it's so central to Jews, Muslims, and Christians. But I want to suggest another answer. And it has to do with the way in which what Israel is doing and maybe trying to do in Gaza really is a kind of, and how the world reacts, is a kind of a referendum on the very notion of historical progress itself. The question of whether we are fundamentally in a different and better world today than we were in previous centuries. So let me try to explain what I mean. As I understand what Israel is doing in Gaza, this is the way I think about it. There's a pretty overwhelming consensus in Israel today among Israeli Jews. There was even before October 7th, but even more strongly since October 7th, that Israel cannot give the Palestinians their own state, certainly not anytime in the foreseeable future. And certainly that Israel is not going to give Palestinians citizenship in the country in which they live, in Israel, right? In this territory which Israel controls. So Israel is going to control these people, millions of people in the West Bank, in Gaza, in East Jerusalem in different ways, who lack basic rights, the basic right of citizenship. And I think until October 7th, the Israeli leaders felt like they were managing that system pretty well. Things were pretty quiet in the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority was working with Israel. Even Hamas, they felt like in a strange kind of way, was working with Israel to keep things relatively quiet. Israel had policies of kind of carrots and sticks. They would let more Palestinian workers come into Israel from the occupied territories, which they thought would give people an incentive to keep things kind of relatively calm because they didn't want to lose that. Of course, there was the ever-present threat of Israeli violence, greater violence, if the Palestinians upset the apple cart. And Israel was moving on to bigger and better things in its view. Normalization with Saudi Arabia, having relations with all kinds of important countries all over the world. I think that's where Israeli political leadership was on October 6th. October 7th showed actually that this management process has really broken down. Because that actually it's really difficult to manage over a long period of time people who you deny basic rights to, because those people are going to resist. Now, of course, the way they resisted on October 7th was horrifying to me, right? I much prefer the many other ways that Palestinians have resisted in ways that are much more ethical. But the point is that people are likely to resist systems of oppression. You can't pretend that they're going to basically sit back and take it for a long time. So the Biden administration wants to recreate a kind of, I think, a system of managing this situation. I mean, they talk about two states, but I think what they really want to do is basically try to kind of put Humpty Dumpty back together again, put someone in charge in Gaza that will kind of keep things quiet, maybe refurbish the Palestinian Authority a little bit, and basically move on to be able to talk about other things. But I think that's going to be extraordinarily difficult to do. The truth is that Gaza was unlivable before October 7th. According to the UN, it was unlivable in 2017. Now it is catastrophically unlivable, right? I mean, most of the hospitals destroyed, most of the housing destroyed, almost everyone displaced, the universities destroyed. And it's extremely difficult for me to see how Gaza is ever rebuilt. Israel has already said that it wants to increase the buffer zones, which means that there will be less space for people in Gaza than there is today. This is already one of the most overcrowded places on earth. The blockade is likely to be tighter than it was before, because Israel's going to say, we can't allow Hamas to get the means to rearm or anyone else to get the means to rearm, right? So it doesn't seem to me remotely plausible that Gaza is really going to be able to rebuild. And I think that there are differences of opinions inside the Israeli government, but I think the people in the Israeli government who have the most coherent vision of what they want to do beyond just muddling through are the people on the right side of the Israeli government who want to create conditions in Gaza that create so much pressure that sooner or later Egypt opens its border and there's a mass exodus from Gaza because Gaza is unlivable. And then those people will not be allowed to return. Egypt has taken a very hard line against this, but Egypt is a quite vulnerable country. I think it's $28 billion in debt. It's in very beholden to the Gulf countries, and that there have been reports that Egypt actually has already been building a wall inside Egypt, essentially to contain people that it imagines might get across from Gaza, particularly from Rafah, which is where this Palestinian population is so kind of centered now because Israel has moved through the rest of the Gaza Strip. So I think that the people, not everyone in the Israeli government, not everyone in Israeli politics, but the people with the clearest vision, who are on the right, have a vision of expulsion. And some of them have been very clear about this for a long time. And I've written about this, but Bezalel Smotrich in 2017 essentially said, if Palestinians don't accept their lack of citizenship and they rise up, they're going to have to leave. And a whole series of other people in the Israeli government, from Tzachi Hanegbi, the national security advisor, to Avi Dichter, the agricultural minister, to Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, over the years have made statements about the potential necessity of expulsion, and it polls pretty well in Israel. So what does this have to do with the course of history? It seems to me one of the reasons that people have difficulty imagining this as a possibility is it just doesn't seem like the kind of thing that countries can get away with in this era of history. If we step back and we think about it a little bit, we're very aware, actually, that many countries did do this in the past. Indeed, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, these were how those countries were created, right? With acts of mass destruction of a native population, which cleared the way for a new country, a kind of a new society. Israel itself could not have been created as a Jewish state without an act of mass expulsion at Israel's founding, because there simply weren't enough Jews there, even in the territory designated for as a Jewish state by the UN, to create a large Jewish majority, which was necessary for a Jewish state. The dirty little secret that people often don't talk about the UN partition plan is that even in the Jewish state that was allocated, there was only a bare Jewish majority in that territory. Again, there just weren't only a third of the population at that time of the entire mandatory Palestine was Jewish. So Israel itself was born through this kind of act of mass expulsion. But I think that the inclination towards believing that history has a trajectory towards progress makes people think that this is the kind of thing you could do in the 19th century. Maybe it was even the kind of thing you could do in the mid-20th century. And there were large population expulsions back in the mid-20th century. But you can't do it today. We now, after the World War II, we created a system of international norms, institutions, a kind of higher ethics that governs the way countries behave. And you simply can't do that anymore. And so it seems to me one of the things that's really at stake in whether this mass expulsion of people from Gaza can occur is the question of whether, in fact, that's true, whether we are in a different era of history, whether there has been some fundamental kind of progress that means that countries can't do what they could do in the past, which would mean that Israel cannot solve the Palestinian problem in the way that the United States solved its Native American problem in the 19th century, which is basically so reducing the population that it was no longer a threat. And I think there is evidence, horrifyingly, that these ideas of progress that people had may not actually be accurate. It's interesting. One of the things that Barack Obama was a kind of quintessential progressive in the sense that he was often quoting Martin Luther King, saying, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And he and John Kerry were often saying to Benjamin Netanyahu at that point, you can't really get away with this, controlling all these Palestinians who lack basic rights. It's not the way the world works anymore. We're no longer in a colonial age. And Netanyahu, who's the son of an historian, I think was in his own way saying, why are you so sure that the history is moving in that particular direction? And I fear that events are, in fact, proving Netanyahu right. We had an act of mass expulsion, which didn't get nearly the attention, I think, in the world that it should have last September, when 100,000 Armenians were expelled from Nagorno-Karabakh. We have Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which looks very likely will not be redressed in the sense that that Russia will ever be forced back and Ukraine will regain all of the control over its sovereignty, beginning with the invasion in 2014 by Russia and then continuing in 2020. We have a government in India which is moving India from a secular state into a very, very aggressive Hindu supremacist state, and really dramatically and very violently rolling back the rights that Muslims had in India. We have, of course, China as a kind of still rising global power. And the United States, we have the possibility of a Trump presidency, and the possibility of kind of Trump-like figures in various places in Europe. So under those conditions, it seems to me that we face the real prospect, in fact, that we are taking a historical turn in which the very fragile norms that we had about state behavior are actually really eroding, and that the kind of mass expulsions that we've seen in earlier periods of history that now are returning again and being thinkable again. And I think if Israel succeeds in doing what many in the Israeli government want to do in Gaza, I think that will open the door to Modi and others around the world seeing it as a possibility to their restive minority populations that they don't want to fully enfranchise. That seems to me what's on the table in terms of what's going on in Gaza, and one way of answering the question of why it matters so much. Because it matters so much, not only because of the fate of those individual people in Gaza, and because of what it says about the United States and the way it behaves around the world, and what it says about Israel, but because of what it says about the course of history. I think that's one of the things that's on the line in this moment.